You are listening to Uranium Spotlight, your weekly podcast on the forces shaping the global uranium fuel market, sponsored by PurePoint Uranium Group. Uranium Spotlight isn't just a podcast, it's a platform. Visit purepoint.ca to access in-depth market briefings, sector analysis, and the inaugural Behind the Curve report, understanding when and how the uranium market turns. If uranium matters to you, you're in the right place. And now, your host, Chris Frostad.
It's June 2nd, 2026, and this week on Uranium Spotlight, uranium prices recover as long-term fundamentals strengthen. India looks to secure massive uranium supplies. Russia and Kazakhstan deepen their nuclear partnership. Ireland reconsiders nuclear power, and Cameco expands its stake in one of the world's premier uranium mines. The uranium spot market finished last week on a firmer footing after several weeks of uneven trading. The spot price opened the week at $84.35 a pound U3O8 and closed Friday at $85. On Monday's publication date, renewed buying interest had pushed the price to $86.10 a pound, representing a weekly gain of $2.75. Activity during May was more robust than many investors may have realized. A total of 52 spot transactions were completed during the month, representing approximately 4 million pounds of U3O8 equivalent. Of those transactions, 43 involved prompt delivery, highlighting that buyers continue to focus on near-term material availability. The term market also remained active. 5 utility contract awards totaling more than 10.5 million pounds were reported during May, and several utilities remained in the market evaluating offers. A new U.S. utility request seeking up to 1.3 million pounds beginning in 2028 emerged last week, adding to a growing list of utilities looking for future supply. Perhaps the most important development remains the May increase in the long-term uranium price to $93 a pound. While spot prices often capture investor attention, the long-term market is where utilities secure future fuel requirements and where producers make investment decisions. The move higher suggests that utilities continue to recognize the growing challenge of securing future supply in a market facing significant uncovered requirements later this decade. At the same time, the global nuclear build-out continues to accelerate. China and Russia now account for roughly 80% of all reactor capacity currently under construction worldwide, reinforcing the scale of future uranium demand growth already underway. For investors, the key takeaway is that while spot prices are recovering, the more important signal is the strengthening long-term market. Utilities continue to seek future supply, contract activity remains healthy, and the long-term price is moving higher as the industry begins to confront a widening supply gap. Last week brought several significant developments from Cameco. First, the company successfully resumed operations at its McArthur River mine and Key Lake mill after heavy flooding in northern Saskatchewan disrupted transportation routes into the operation. Despite the interruption, Cameco maintained its production guidance for 2026, demonstrating both the resilience of the operation and the importance of these assets to the global uranium supply chain. At the same time, Cameco and Orano announced the acquisition of TEPCO's 5% interest in Cigar Lake joint venture. Cameco increased its ownership to more than 57%, while Orano increased its stake to more than 42%. The transaction further consolidates ownership of one of the world's highest grade and most strategically important uranium mines. While these developments modestly strengthen Western uranium supply, they do little to solve the broader structural challenge facing the market. More than 1 billion pounds of future reactor requirements remain uncovered globally, while many existing mines are approaching the later stage of their productive lives. Even successful operations such as McArthur River and Cigar Lake cannot single-handedly satisfy growing demand from utilities around the world. For investors, this matters because even positive production news from major producers does not materially alter the long-term supply outlook. The market still requires new mines, new discoveries, and substantial investment if future reactor demand is to be met. India's nuclear ambitions took center stage last week following comments from the country's High Commissioner to Canada, indicating that India would gladly purchase as much uranium from Cameco as the company could produce. India already has a long-term supply agreement with Cameco covering nearly 22 million pounds of uranium between 2027 and 2035. However, India's nuclear plans extend well beyond existing contracts. The country intends to increase its nuclear generating capacity by more than tenfold as it seeks to support economic growth, expand electrification, and reduce emissions. The challenge is scale. India is approaching a population of 1.5 billion people and is expected to experience some of the fastest growth in energy demand anywhere in the world over the coming decade. That demand growth is forcing policymakers to think aggressively about long-term energy security, and nuclear power is increasingly viewed as a critical component of that strategy. What makes the story particularly important is that India is not alone. China continues to build reactors at an unprecedented pace. Existing Western reactor fleets still require fuel. Emerging nuclear nations are entering the market. Yet the number of major uranium suppliers remains relatively limited. Many traditional supply sources are already heavily committed. Kazakhstan continues to direct large portions of future production towards China and Russia. African production increasingly involves Chinese or Russian participation. Australia remains constrained by political and regulatory challenges in several jurisdictions. For investors, this matters because India's comments provide another example of how competition for future uranium supply is intensifying. The issue is no longer whether demand will grow. The question increasingly becomes who will secure the fuel needed to support that growth. Another major development last week was the formal agreement between Russia and Kazakhstan to advance construction of Kazakhstan's first large-scale nuclear power plant. The project is expected to include 2 Russian-designed VVER-1200 reactors and will be supported through extensive cooperation on fuel supply, maintenance, and future operations. Viewed in isolation, the announcement may appear to be a straightforward infrastructure project. Viewed in a broader context, however, it highlights the growing integration occurring between 3 of the world's most influential nuclear nations. China dominates global reactor construction. Russia remains the leading exporter of nuclear technology and reactor projects. Kazakhstan remains the world's largest uranium producer. Together, these countries increasingly represent the center of gravity within the global nuclear industry. The concern for Western utilities is not necessarily that uranium will disappear from the market. Rather, it is that future supply could become increasingly concentrated among countries whose strategic priorities may differ from those of North America and Europe. As long-term supply agreements continue to proliferate and domestic nuclear programs expand, more uranium production could become effectively tied up years before delivery. This would leave utilities with fewer available suppliers and less flexibility in securing future fuel requirements. For investors, this matters because fuel security is becoming just as important as fuel availability. Countries that control uranium production, fuel processing, and reactor construction are steadily increasing their influence over the future direction of the nuclear industry. One of the more surprising stories last week came from Ireland, where the country's governing party signaled support for removing Ireland's long-standing statutory ban on nuclear energy. While the proposal would not immediately authorize reactor construction, it would allow policymakers to formally consider nuclear power as part of the country's future energy strategy. For decades, nuclear power was effectively excluded from Ireland's energy discussions. That position is now beginning to change as governments around the world confront rising electricity demand, growing concerns over energy security, and the challenge of achieving emissions reduction targets without sacrificing reliability. Ireland is not alone. Across Europe and beyond, countries that previously opposed nuclear power are reopening discussions, extending reactor lifetimes, reconsidering phase-out policies, or actively pursuing new nuclear development. What makes this shift significant is that it reflects changing public attitudes as much as changing government policy. Concerns about affordability, reliability, and energy independence are increasingly outweighing many of the historical objections to nuclear power. For investors, this matters because every country that reconsiders nuclear energy expands the potential market for uranium. The broader trend is clear. More nations are moving toward nuclear power than away from it, creating a steadily expanding foundation for long-term uranium demand.
You've been listening to Uranium Spotlight, your weekly podcast dedicated to the latest developments shaping the uranium fuel market and its role in the global energy landscape. Sponsored by PurePoint Uranium Group. While our passion for the sector is undeniable, nothing discussed here should be considered investment advice. Our mission is to provide a clear, balanced view of the forces influencing uranium prices and the nuclear fuel cycle. For deeper analysis and market briefings, visit purepoint.ca. Join us again next Tuesday for another edition of Uranium Spotlight.